Welcome to The Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. We can be found on YouTube and Facebook. Just search for The Writer's Dream. Today's a special day. I don't often talk about what studio we're in or where we're pre-recording this program or what date it is or what season it is, but today is 9/11/2015. And so I'd like to take just a minute to send prayers and thoughts to the victims and the survivors of that terrible tragedy. And I would like to send a special prayer to those of us who were born in New York or lived in New York or grew up in New York or just love New York. So I'm going to send a kiss to New York City. And this is a perfect lead-in for my guest, whose name is Pauli Libsohn. And she is the editor of her mother's poems called Immortal Kisses, Confessions of a Poet. Welcome, Pauli.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
I'm glad you're here, and you've been talking to me about your mother's book, and it's so exciting. Can you give us a little background?
Yes, I'll tell you how this all started. At first, I never dreamed that I would ever be an editor of a book. And what happened is that back in 1971, when I was a graduate student at CW Post College, I had an assignment to write a poem. And I was at a total loss, and I was very nervous about it. And I came home, and I said to my mother, I have to write a poem. I said, if I write this, will you tell me if it's good enough to hand into class? And she said yes. So I did, and I titled it Imitation of a Poem because I was so nervous. And I read it to her, and she said, terrific, feel free to hand it in, it's wonderful. So with that, I did. I came home, and she said to me, come here, I want to read you something. And she wrote a poem, and she titled it Duet, and she wrote it because of my assignment. I had given her the idea, and I was flabbergasted. I couldn't get over it. And she, too, was very surprised because the poetry just flowed from her pen. And she had never written anything before. And all of a sudden, this came out of nowhere. So we sat at the kitchen table, and I typed it up for her. And subsequent to that, almost every day, I came home from school, and she wrote another poem. And she would say, let me read this to you. And I would sit there, and she'd read it, and I'd tell her yes or no, and then we would type it up. And this went on over the course of about 35 years.
Wow.
She never stopped writing. She got the inspiration from that class that I took. So I never really realized how wonderful her poems were until I bought a book of poetry by Robert Frost. And I was reading it one night. And I said to myself, you know, this sounds like my mother's poetry. So at about 10 o'clock at night, I went flying down into her room, and I woke both she and my father up, and I said, listen, I said, your poetry is just as good as Robert Frost's. Well, they were hysterical. So I got out their poetry, and at that hour, I started reading it to them and reading Robert Frost's poetry. And it was at that moment that she had the realization that her poetry could actually be as good as Robert Frost's. So then she and I became serious about her poetry, and we got to work on it, and I said, look, I said, we have to publish this poetry. I said, you have written gold here. So we worked on this poetry for about 10 years, and finally we got up a manuscript, but what happened was she passed away. So I put it on the shelf, and I left it for about 3 years, and then I went back to it. And I wanted to keep my promise to my mother. It was all about keeping the promise, and then it was all about getting her message out. And I felt it was a very beautiful message because she wrote romantic poetry.
I was going to ask you about
Yes.
that. The title of the book is Immortal Kisses. That's
Yes.
pretty provocative.
Yes. Well,
What's that about?
Well, I chose that because I felt that that was the beginning of her and my father's love affair. They met on the beach in Far Rockaway, She was 12 years old, and he was 17. He was the lifeguard on the beach. And she fell madly in love with him, but she didn't know how to capture his attention because she was 12. So what she would do is she would bring books to the beach, and she would interest him in these books. And she would give him assignments to read the books, and then they would discuss them. And then over the winter months, she would load him up with all these books, and she would correspond with him about these books. She never let him go.
You know, that's so interesting because ordinarily when a young woman wants to gain the attention of a young man,
Right.
she'll try to think of something that he likes.
Right.
And she picked something that she really liked.
Correct.
And that was so smart because if
Yes.
he then hooked into it
Yes,
as
he
well, then that's a good match.
He couldn't get over her. And she was very tenacious, and as I said, she never let him go. And because of that, my father developed his love of literature also. And they continued like that every summer, and they had bungalows at the beach in Far Rockaway. And so what she did was she wrote the poem Immortal Kisses, which commemorates the beginning of their love affair.
Aw.
And if you want, I'll read you that
Yes,
poem.
please.
Yes, I would love to read that. It's right here. And it goes, ghosts imprisoned by yesterday, stand and guard and laugh when I grow dizzy with the taste of kisses remembered, kisses frozen in my throat, kisses you gave me when we danced on the beach, immortal kisses.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And that was in memory of their love affair on the beach. And I truly believe that most of these poems in here are about their love affair. However, she also had a love affair with nature. And she loved the birds and the flowers and the trees, and she could not get over them. And she could not get over how someone, unbeknownst to her, created all this. And she would always go on and on about petals of flowers, the colorations, the trees, their leaves, the branches, the birds. She was in love with the birds. And what happened also was she became friendly with one little bird in our backyard. We had a lot of gardens. And she named that bird Wendy. And that little bird followed her around for an entire season. And it would wait for her. And she became friends with it. And then at the end of the season, it actually came to say goodbye to her because it had to migrate south. And she named it Wendy, and it was just so wonderful. And I think all of nature knew that she was their friend. And also, she just could not put down her pen. She would take her pen and pad everywhere she went. And even when she was driving her car, if she saw a flower or a tree that she liked, she would pull over on the side of the road and she would write about that flower and that tree. And she would come home and she'd say to me, look what I did today, look what I created. And she was so excited, she couldn't wait. And she'd say, we have to type it up right now. And I did. And she wrote over 200 poems initially that we had prepared for this manuscript. And then, unbeknownst to me, after I finished this, I was going through her papers, and there were more poems that I had not discovered. And I am now working on another book of her writings.
Yes, you had mentioned that.
Yes, yes. And it's all in the same vein, but it's different. And I'm very excited about that also.
Did you find that in reading her poems from the beginning when she first started, because obviously she probably had this innate talent all her life.
Yes, yes.
And then all of a sudden, when you were talking about her dying and you left her project for 3 years,
Yes.
I have a feeling that a lot of literature has to cook. I call it cooking.
Yes,
It has to
it
sit
does.
somewhere and,
Yes.
and age or cook or
Yes.
whatever. And then when you pick it up again, you have a whole fresh outlook on that piece of literature. And but my original question was, did you see a change in the poetry that she wrote?
Yes, she definitely developed. In the beginning, it was gorgeous, but then she expanded on her thoughts and the way she actually wrote. And then she wrote also about different passages in her life. And a lot of these poems are based on that, all of her life's experiences and her intellectual development, because she had a tremendous love of literature. She was always reading, always going to museums, she and my father both. And all these poems reflect that love.
Well, the back of the book, it has something that she wrote
Yes.
about herself. I would
Yes.
like to read that.
Yes.
So it's Inklings of Myself by
Yes.
Pauli Libsohn. What interests me? The mysterious character and many faces of living things, and how it is possible to philosophize about them in a simple way in the form of poetry. I write like a painter. I am an impressionist creating poetic pictures that suggest that the visual culminates in emotion, and the impressions of my emotional surroundings are poured like liquid over the pages of my poetry. Eclectic in style, the bones of my poetry are shaped by an awareness of the interaction of trees, birds, and flowers. I am in love with their quiet power, and I cannot imagine life without them. The moon, the willow, the sea, and even the hidden violet have been my partners, and I have dictated what I should write. I believe that while the bedrocks of nature are ever bearing, they remain as mysterious as the hidden springs of human desire that lead us all to listen for the sounds of a certain step behind the garden wall. Poetry and art bathe in the same light, and while the artist uses brushstrokes, there is a common language between artist and writer. The expressions of the artist on canvas have always been inspirational to me, but the written page is my real obsession.
Yes.
She's really quite a writer.
She is.
Quite a beautiful woman. There's a picture
Yes,
of her on the
yes.
back of the book. I'm almost tempted to turn this book around and see if our camera people can capture that. I know
Yes. She was quite.
they can try.
Yes.
While we talk, they can try. And I can't get the book to start. Okay.
And one poem that I would like to read is a poem that she wrote about a dress that she always wanted when she was a young girl, but she didn't have enough money to purchase. And she always spoke about that dress throughout her whole life. It was an apple green dress, and she could never get it because she was poor. And she wrote a poem, and I'd like to read that poem. Let me see. What became of the apple green dress once so dear to me? I am wanting it again, and I am wanting the girl who ran in it, flirting with the sea, and the gulls who surrounded her. On a winter's night, I close my eyes and remember how I smelled of salt when the dress was wet. Farewell, sweet dress. I loved you, and you never asked me why. 'Twas for your pretty color. And it shows in so much of her poetry, everything goes back to the sea. Everything goes back to the beach, because that's where everything so wonderful happened to her. And she
And that's
always
where life
writes,
began on this
Yes.
planet, in the sea.
Yes, that's right. And so much of this reflects the beach and the sea and my father's love. So, and there's also another poem that I would like to read.
I was going to ask you.
Yes, called Memorial to Love. How we loved the moon all those nights when you cradled me in your arms, and the breath of our longings surrounded the swans who climbed out of the lake to stare at us like ghosts. And when we looked in their eyes, we saw years flooding out, years that never warned us that nothing lives long, not even the messages of love moaned low by the bullfrog at midnight. And I thought that was just so gorgeous, the images.
Yes.
Yes.
Her love of nature, I think that's very inspirational. I think it's
Yes.
inspirational to a lot of poems.
Yes.
Tell us about yourself, though. What have you been doing all these years besides this?
Oh, well.
What happened after CW Post?
After CW Post College, well, I thought I was going to be a teacher, an English teacher, but that did not work out. So I got a job as a receptionist at a foreign car dealership, and I've been there ever since, and I'm there 34 years, and I'm the secretary receptionist in the showroom, and I love it. I'm like in a fishbowl, and I see so many different people all day long, and people that I would never have met otherwise, and it's very exciting. It never stops there, and
You're a people person.
yes, I have a terrific personality. I love to talk, and I
How
feel
many
that
cars
that's
have you sold for them?
Oh,
Only kidding. We're not
okay,
supposed to talk.
right.
Okay. So then, what year did you start this in? When did you really decide to do this? Your mother passed away.
I really, really said this was it in 2011. And I worked on it from January 2011. And straight through, I never realized how hard it would be.
Yes.
I thought that since the poems were already written, that it would just be 1, 2, 3, you just type them up and that's it. But that's not the case. And you have to constantly write and rewrite and edit. And
then there's formatting. You have to format the book.
yes, it was a tremendous undertaking. And I never knew what hit me.
Yes. I know that feeling.
Yeah. But I was driven. And again, I wanted to do this for my mother. And I wanted everyone to know about her because she was so special. And she had such a special message. People, in today's world, it's a very fast world. It's a world of cell phones, fast food, fast everything, fast love. And she really was a romantic. And you don't see poetry like this anymore, I believe. And it's romantic, and it's a throwback to years gone by, I think.
I also think that Long Island is, I talked to a number of poets, and I always ask them, how come there are so many poets on Long Island? Because there's a big poetry following on Long Island. There are so many poetry groups,
Right.
Poetry readings,
Right.
and basically one gentleman told me, he said, it's just like it is for painters. It's the light, it's the sea, it's the vegetation. Long Island in its natural state,
Right.
and even where it's been manicured, is really very beautiful.
It is.
People think of it as, the Long Island
Right.
Expressway and the 110
Right.
corridor.
Right.
It's really a lot beyond that.
It is.
But you did tell me the story of what happened when you first published, the flurry of excitement.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Okay. I couldn't get over that the book had actually been published. And what happened is that all the local newspapers got a hold of this story, and they published the story of my mother and myself and how the book came to be. And I was thrilled. I could not get over that.
How did they find out about the book? Did they just find it on Amazon, or?
No, what I did was I called them, and I said, I have a very wonderful, interesting story to tell. And I said, it's refreshing in today's world. And they listened, and they couldn't get over it. They thought it was very sweet and nice and wholesome. Just a nice